Καλησπέρα κυρίες και κύριοι. Είμαι η Ευγενία Χανδρή, Βρετανίδα πρόεδρος του Επιμελητηρίου και θέλω να σας καλωσορίσω θερμά σε αυτό το υπέροχο και ιστορικά σημαντικό κτίριο της Αθήνας, την Παλιά Βουλή και στη συζήτηση για το BREXIT. Welcome to all of you. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Eugenia Chandris and I'm the British President of the Chamber. This, the old Parliament of Athens, is a breathtaking location, steeped in historical significance and a very appropriate choice for today's debate on Brexit. The United Kingdom and Greece have many affinities, either than contemplating exiting. I shall note just one example. The origin of the word rhetoric is Greek, and the English are indeed great orators, rhetores in Greek, and hence excellent debaters. To hold this event in this Parliament, in a city where freedom of speech and the voice of opinion resonated in the ancient world, is very special. We have an action-packed evening ahead, so let me welcome our distinguished guests. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Denis McShane, a masterful figure in British politics and author of Brexit, How Britain Will Leave Europe, which highlights the perils that will result from such a move. On our debating squad are on the stay side Simon Nixon, a distinguished journalist, chief European commentator for the Wall Street Journal, and Professor Spiros Floriatis, director of the European Public Law Organization and a former minister. In the Leave camp are Ian Martin, a famous Scottish journalist, former political editor of The Scotsman, and Mariano Davis, president of the British Chamber of Commerce in Denmark. Moderator of the debate is former Vice President of the European Parliament and the Chamber's strategy advisor, George Dimitrakopoulos, and there will be a comparison between the Greek and British exit issues by Yannis Paleologos from the Kathimerini. We're also delighted to welcome Pavlos Tsimas from Sky, who is also the editor-at-large for Huffington Post Greece, who will be moderating the Q&A session. And finally, I would like to thank our sponsors, without whom this event could not have taken place. Our principal sponsor is Matrix, and many thanks also to Evropi Asfalistiki and Nikos Makropoulos. Aegean Airlines, the Metropolitan Hotel and Chandris Hotels and Resorts, Pernod Ricard Hélas, and KPMG. And finally, thanks to our communication sponsors, HuffPost Greece and Kathimerini. And now, for a more animated description of tonight's events, I hand you over to Haris Ikonomopoulos, the Chamber's Greek President. Thank you.
Εξοχότατε κύριε πρώην Πρόεδρε της Βουλής, κυρίες και κύριοι. Παρά την εξαιρετική τιμή την οποία οφείλουμε στους εξαιρετικά σημαντικούς προσκεκλημένους μας, δεν νομίζω ότι θα μπορούσε Έλληνας να διανοηθεί σήμερα να μιλήσει σε οποιαδήποτε άλλη γλώσσα από αυτό εδώ το χώρο, παρά στη γλώσσα μας. Επιτρέψτε μου να σας πω ένα πολύ σύντομο ιστορικό για αυτή τη συζήτηση. 11 μήνες πριν, 12, τον Ιούνιο του 2015, είχαμε καταλήξει αυτή η συζήτηση να πραγματοποιείται την εβδομάδα που αποφασίστηκε το ελληνικό δημοψήφισμα. Καλεσμένοι μας τότε ήταν ο τότε Υπουργός Οικονομίας και Οικονομικών, ο κύριος Γιάννης Βαρουφάκης, ο κύριος Σάιμον Νίξον, ο κύριος Ντένις Μακσέιν και ο κύριος Λογαΐτης. Δυστυχώς, παρότι ανυπομονούσαμε τότε τη λεξιμαχία μεταξύ Βαρουφάκη-Νίξον για τα τρέχοντα ζητήματα της ελληνικής διαπραγμάτευσης, η εξέλιξη του δημοψηφίσματος δεν επέτρεψε αυτή τη συζήτηση που και ο ίδιος ο Γιάννης Βαρουφάκης ήθελε να γίνει. Είχα παρατηρήσει και τότε μια εξαιρετική διστακτικότητα ελληνικών και ξένων επιχειρήσεων να στηρίξουν αυτό το οποίο, αν συνέβαινε, τις κατέστρεφε. Και αυτό το οποίο, αν συνέβαινε, τις κατέστρεφε, αναφορικά με το ελληνικό δημοψήφισμα, ήταν η έξοδος της Ελλάδας από την Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση, ως συνέπεια του δημοψηφίσματος, αναφορικά με το βρετανικό δημοψήφισμα παραμένει ως κίνδυνος, παρότι από ό,τι φαίνεται μειούμενος, η έξοδος Βρετανίας από το φυσικό της χώρο, την Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση. Σημειώνω τη διστακτικότητα όλων όσων βλάπτονται, κάτι το οποίο θα δούμε και στη συνέχεια, απέναντι στην πολύ μεγάλη εφράδια όσων δεν έχουν τίποτα να χάσουν. Και δεν αναφέρουμε βεβαίως στους σημερινούς υποστηρικτές της εξόδου της Βρετανίας. Στη σημερινή δεξιμαχία, στο σημερινό debate, δεν θα σας αποκαλύψουμε εάν τυχόν κάποιος από τους ομιλητές δεν πιστεύει αυτό το οποίο υποστηρίζει. Άλλωστε, η ρητορική υποστήριξη του αντιθέτου δεν είναι ντροπή, αλλά είναι ταλέντο. Θα έχει μεγαλύτερο ενδιαφέρον να το καταλάβετε μόνοι σας. Και καταλαβαίνετε ότι θα ήταν άδικο να διαχωρίσουμε αυτούς που υποστηρίζουν πράγματα τα οποία σήμερα για αυτή τη συζήτηση δεν πιστεύουν δημόσια ή υποστηρίζουν άλλους. Γιατί στο δεύτερο αυτό έχουμε συνηθίσει όχι μόνο από τους δικούς μας Έλληνες πολιτικούς, αλλά εν γέννη από τους πολιτικούς καριέρας και στην Ευρώπη και αλλού. Επίσης, θα ήταν άδικο να κατακρίνει όλους αυτούς οι οποίοι δεν βάζουν τα χρήματά τους εκεί μου το στόμα τους, κάποιος ο οποίος έχει πάρει ρίσκα που πολλοί από εσάς εδώ ξέρετε ότι ήταν ίσως δυσανάλογα από τις δικές του δυνάμεις. Είναι όμως ακράδαντη πεποίθηση όλων μας ότι στα σημαντικά προηγούνται τα σημαντικά και έπονται οι υπόλοιποι. Γιατί εάν η Ελλάδα καταστραφεί, είμαστε όλοι κατεστραμμένοι. Αν η Βρετανία πληγεί, όλοι οι Βρετανοί πλήγονται. Συνεπώς, αν κάποιος από εμάς αυτό το υποστεί λίγο νωρίτερα, θα είναι αδιάφορο, εφόσον βέβαια έχει κάποια πιθανότητα να βοηθήσει στο γενικότερο καλό. Κυρίες και κύριοι, ζούμε σε ένα πολιτικό χρόνο που ένα πρόβλημα, αντί να αντιμετωπίζεται, αντί να βρίσκεται μια λύση, συνήθως αντιμετωπίζεται με την εφεύρεση ενός άλλου παράλληλου προβλήματος ή με την όξυνση ενός άλλου υφιστάμενου. Παράδειγμα, η Ελλάδα των εκάστοτε κυβερνώντων υποκρίνεται ότι κάνει μεταρρυθμίσεις, χωρίς όμως να τις κάνει. Δανειστές και εταίροι υποκρίνονται ότι αποδέχονται όσα τελικά συμφωνούνται, ενώ ξέρουν ότι είναι παντελώς ακατάλληλα και μόνο όταν τους παίρνουν χαμπάρι τα δικά τους μέσα, ο κύριος Νίξον και όλοι οι άλλοι οι οποίοι ασχολούνται με τον έλεγχο της πολιτικής εξουσίας, αρχίζουν να το ξανασυζητάνε. Το χειρότερο όμως είναι ότι εμείς ο λαός προσποιούμαστε τους πολίτες, ενώ εξακολουθούμε να συμπεριφερόμαστε ως υπήκοοι. Αυτό δυστυχώς δεν είναι πρόβλημα μόνο της Ελλάδας. Είναι πρόβλημα της Γαλλίας σήμερα, είναι πρόβλημα της Ιταλίας σήμερα, είναι πρόβλημα της Ισπανίας σήμερα. Ίσως είναι και πρόβλημα της Γερμανίας, πάντως είναι πρόβλημα της Ευρώπης ολόκληρης. Και στο βαθμό που υποστηρίζεται με πιστικά επιχειρήματα από τους θειασότες του BREXIT, μεταξύ των οποίων τον πιο ίσως γνωστό, τον κύριο Μπόρις Τζόνσον, τον πρώην δήμαρχο του Λονδίνου, ότι η Ευρώπη δεν είναι δημοκρατική, είναι αντιδημοκρατική. Στο βαθμό που κάτι τέτοιο έχει οποιαδήποτε βάση, αυτό είναι το πραγματικό πρόβλημα. Η δημοκρατία, κυρίες και κύριοι, προϋποθέτει δύο ελάχιστες προϋποθέσεις. Πολίτες, εκπαιδευμένους πολίτες και ένα ελάχιστο επίπεδο οικονομικής ευμάρειας για όλους. Όποτε ένα από τα δύο εκλείπει, η δημοκρατία καταρρίπτεται. Και το μεγάλο ζητούμενο στη συζήτηση και στο δημοψήφισμα της 23ης Ιουνίου στη Μεγάλη Βρετανία, στις συζητήσεις που ακολουθούν στη Δανία, στην Ολλανδία και σε άλλες χώρες, στη Γαλλία, ένα ποσοστό 53% των ερωτηθέντων τώρα τελευταία, θέλει να αναθεωρηθεί η σχέση της Γαλλίας με την Ευρώπη. Στο βαθμό λοιπόν που αυτά τα ζητήματα δεν απαντώνται, ο κίνδυνος είναι πάντα παρόν. Και θα είναι ιδιαίτερα παρόν αν το αποτέλεσμα αυτού του δημοψηφίσματος δεν είναι ένα ξεκάθαρο 60 ναι, 40 όχι, 70 ναι, 30 όχι, αλλά ένα 51-49, όποιο και να κερδίσει. 55-45. Αναμφίβολα, εκτός από την έλλειψη δημοκρατίας, από το έλλειμμα δημοκρατίας στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση, το οποίο μπορεί να αντιμετωπιστεί με τη συλλογική συνεργασία των κοιτίδων της δημοκρατίας, και η Μεγάλη Βρετανία είναι μέσα στην Ευρώπη, πριν ακόμα και από τη Γαλλία, μία από τις βασικές κοιτίδες της δημοκρατίας. Αναμφίβολα, η Ευρώπη δεν είναι αποτελεσματική. Και αρκεί να δούμε τι γίνεται στην Ελλάδα ξανά. Ενώ χρειαζόμαστε να προσελκύσουμε τους πιο ικανούς, επινοητικούς, παραγωγικούς, δυναμικούς, πλούσιους ανθρώπους και επιχειρήσεις αυτού του κόσμου, για να παράξουν πλούτο, να υπάρξουν επενδύσεις, να υπάρξει ευτυχία, κάνουμε ό,τι μπορούμε για να τους τιμωρήσουμε. Κάνουμε ό,τι μπορούμε για να ενθαρρύνουμε την αεργία. Θα σας δώσω ένα πολύ σύντομο παράδειγμα. Ένας εξαιρετικά κοντινός μου άνθρωπος μόλις επέστρεψε από τη Βαλέτα, από τη Μάλτα, όπου δίκαζε μια υπόθεση αλλοδαπών πελατών του. Η υπόθεση αυτή διεθνώς θεωρείται για οποιαδήποτε χώρα του πολιτισμένου κόσμου λαχείο, σε περίπτωση επιτυχίας. Στην Ελλάδα φαίνεται ότι αυτό είναι κατάρα. Κυρίες και κύριοι, ξέρετε γιατί? Γιατί αν υποθέσουμε ότι αυτός ο άνθρωπος κερδίζει 10 εκατομμύρια ευρώ, ξέρετε τι θα πρέπει να πληρώσει το ελληνικό δημόσιο με βάση αυτά τα οποία έχουν προβλεφθεί για μετά τα πρώτα 40.000? 12. Εισπράττει 10, πληρώνει 12. Ό,τι να είναι. Ανεξάρτητα από τα παραπάνω, είτε δηλαδή οι εκάστοτε κυβερνώντες και δανειστές είναι ηλίθιοι, είτε είναι ακατάλληλοι και απλά προσποιούνται ότι δεν είναι, είτε οι εκάστοτε κυβερνώντες και δανειστές είναι έξυπνοι ή καριερίστες και απλά προσποιούνται τους ευήθεις, είτε μακάρι ξέρουν καλύτερα από εμάς, μακάρι Θεέ μου, το αποτέλεσμα και στην Ελλάδα και στη Βρετανία, κυρίες και κύριοι, είναι το ίδιο. Αυτό το δημοψήφισμα, θα μου επιτρέψετε να πω ότι, τουλάχιστον για μένα, είναι ένα επίοικος ακατανόητο δημοψήφισμα, που θέτει ένα ανόητο δίλημμα. Από τη μια, διεκδικεί το αυτονόητο, την παραμονή στην Ευρώπη, αυτή την οποία η Μεγάλη Βρετανία σε 2 μεγάλους πολέμους έσωσε. Την Ένωση για την διατήρηση της ειρήνης, στην οποία πρωταγωνίστησε. Και ταυτόχρονα διακινδυνεύει το δεδομένο. Χωρίς σχέδιο, χωρίς όραμα, χωρίς όφελος για τους πολίτες, το δημοψήφισμα είναι η ύψιστη έκφραση της λαϊκής κυριαρχίας. Είναι έγκλημα ή λάθος, όπως θα έλεγε ο Ταλεϊράνδος, να το υπονομεύουμε με τέτοιο τρόπο. Το δημοψήφισμα πρέπει να εξυπηρετεί τα συμφέροντα των πολιτών, όχι τα συμφέροντα εκάστοτε πολιτικών. Και δυστυχώς και στην Ελλάδα και στη Μεγάλη Βρετανία, μέχρι στιγμής, αυτό φαίνεται να γίνεται. Συγκρίνουμε την Ελλάδα με Μεγάλη Βρετανία. Πολύ ενδιαφέρον. Δεν νομίζω όμως ότι είναι δική μου η δουλειά. Δεν μπορώ να συγκρίνω εύκολα την Ελλάδα με τη Βρετανία. Έχουμε την 5η μεγαλύτερη οικονομία του κόσμου, η οποία έχει καταφέρει να προσελκύσει τους πιο παραγωγικούς, επινοητικούς, δυναμικούς, πλούσιους, ικανούς ανθρώπους και επιχειρήσεις αυτού του κόσμου. Και έχουμε μια Ελλάδα η οποία κάνει την πορεία για να τους διώξει. Και αν μπουν, να τους τιμωρήσει και παραδειγματικά. Τα δικά μας νομίζουμε ότι τα ξέρουμε. Είναι ώρα, κυρίες και κύριοι, να σταματήσουμε να μιλάμε, όπως λένε οι Βρετανοί, about nickels and dimes. Είναι ώρα να θυμηθούμε την ιστορία, την οποία συνεχώς ξεχνούμε, και να συζητήσουμε για το όραμα. Πέρα από οποιαδήποτε στενή τεχνοκρατική ανάλυση της σημερινής συγκυρίας του ευρωπαϊκού γίγνεσθε, μένω με την πεποίθηση ότι η κρίση αυτή εξακολουθεί να αποτελεί μια μοναδική ευκαιρία αναστοχασμού της ευρωπαϊκής ενοποίησης. Δεν είναι ανάγκη βεβαίως η Ευρώπη να γίνει μία χώρα. Έχει όμως τη δυνατότητα να προχωρήσει στην ευρωπαϊκή ολοκλήρωση, εμβαθύνοντας τη δημοκρατία, κάτι που και η Ελλάδα έχει ανάγκη. Ίσως πάνω και πρώτα από οτιδήποτε άλλο η Ελλάδα έχει ανάγκη να εμβαθύνει τη δημοκρατία. Μένω με την πεποίθηση ότι η σημερινή κρίση, μία σημαντική έκφραση της οποίας είναι το δημοψήφισμα της 23ης Ιουνίου, αποτελεί μια μοναδική ευκαιρία για να ξεπεράσουμε τη σημερινή γραφειοκρατική βάσανο, τους μόνο οικονομικούς υπολογισμούς επαγγελματιών πολιτικών των Βρυξελών και άλλων ευρωπαϊκών πρωτευουσών. Και είναι μια μοναδική ευκαιρία οι ζωντανές δυνάμεις της ευρωπαϊκής κοινωνίας, στην Ελλάδα, στη Βρετανία, στη Γαλλία, στη Γερμανία, στην Ισπανία, στη Δανία, σε όλη την Ευρώπη, να συνεργαστούν ώστε αντί να διαλύσουμε αυτό το οποίο με τόσο κόπο και τόσο κόστος έχει αρχίσει να χτίζεται. Η Ευρώπη, κυρίες και κύριοι, ζητάει όπως και η Ελλάδα όραμα, χρειάζεται όπως και η Ελλάδα ηγέτες. Και μιλώντας για ηγέτες, επιτρέψτε μου να κλείσω με τα λόγια ενός πολύ σημαντικού ανθρώπου, ο οποίος αναδείχθηκε ως ηγέτης μετά από πολλές ήττες. Η Καλύπολη ήταν μια από αυτές. Όταν μιλώντας το 1946 ή το 1948 στη σύσταση του Συμβουλίου της Ευρώπης, είπε κάτι που ακόμα και οι συντηρητικοί απογονοί του, επίγονοι του, δεν νομίζω ότι μπορούν αυτή τη στιγμή να αμφισβητήσουν, ανεξάρτητα από τη ρητορική την οποία υιοθετούν ενώπιση του συγκεκριμένου δημοψηφίσματος και για εσωτερικούς πολιτικούς λόγους. Η Ευρώπη, είχε πει ο Σερ Winston Churchill, ή θα ενωθεί ή θα χαθεί. Η σημερινή συζήτηση, λοιπόν, κυρίες και κύριοι, δεν αφορά μόνο ένα δημοψήφισμα στη Μεγάλη Βρετανία στις 23 Ιουνίου, εξαιρετικά κρίσιμο, από το οποίο μπορεί να προκύψει σε πιθανό BREXIT και πιθανό GREXIT. Και όχι μόνο. Αφορά το μέλλον όλων μας. Και θα είναι χρήσιμη αν στο μυαλό μας αναλογιζόμασταν ποιες θα ήταν οι συνέπειες ενός ναι ή ενός όχι στο βρετανικό δημοψήφισμα, όχι μόνο στους επόμενους μήνες, αλλά στα επόμενα 35 χρόνια. Το 2050, όταν η γενιά του 2000 θα είναι ήδη 50. Για σκεφτείτε πόσο κοντά είναι το 1981 με σήμερα και αναλογιστείτε πόσο πιστεύετε ότι μακριά είναι το 2050. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ τους διακεκριμένους εμιλητές για την εξαιρετική τιμή που κάνουν στο Ελληνοβρετανικό Επιμελητήριο και στη χώρα μας να ξεσηκωθούν από τον τόπο τους και να έρθουν να συζητήσουν εδώ ένα ζήτημα το οποίο δεν είναι αμιγώς βρετανικό. Είναι ζήτημα ευρωπαϊκό. Είναι ζήτημα ελληνικό. Είναι ζήτημα όλων μας. Και με αυτά τα λίγα λόγια θα μου επιτρέψετε να δώσω το λόγο στο βασικό ομιλητή, τον Dr. Dennis McShane, πρώην Υπουργό Ευρωπαϊκών Υποθέσεων στην κυβέρνηση Tony Blair, διακεκριμένο ευρωπαϊστή, συγγραφέα, έναν άνθρωπο ο οποίος πρώτος διείδε τους κινδύνους της οκνηρίας και της αβελτηρίας όσων έχουν να χάσουν από μια πιθανή έξοδο της Βρετανίας και της εξαιρετικής εφράδιας όσων έχουν μόνο να κερδίσουν στον πολιτικό στίβο της χώρας τους. Ακόμα και αν αυτά δεν είναι ακριβή, κύριε Μάρτιν, κύριε Ντέιβις, ως υποστηρικτές του Leave, παρακαλώ θεωρήστε τα σαν ένα ερέθισμα για να προκαλέσω μεγαλύτερη ένταση στο μεταξύ σας διάλογο. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I've just asked our host, Harris, when this clock starts to tick, and he says it doesn't apply to me. And I remember being with the former Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, at an absolutely packed, sweaty, standing room only hall on Euston Road in London to hear an address by Mr. Hugo Chavez, the President of Venezuela. Mr. Hugo Chavez was the Yanis Varoufakis of his day, extremely popular and charismatic figure, but he was Latin American, not Greek. And so as Ken was presenting him, he said, "Now, comrades, brothers and sisters, it's my deep honor and pleasure to invite you to listen to Comrade President Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, who is attacking American imperialism and building socialism in Latin America. Comrade Chavez, I give you the floor." So this is going through an interpreter into Chavez's head. Muchas gracias, compañero Ken. ¿Y cuánto tiempo tengo? He likes to know how long he's got. Oh, as long as you like. 3 hours later, without any interpretation. Right, so that's taken about half my time. Now you've got fantastic speakers who are going to debate, so I'm not going to make necessarily an anti-Brexit pitch. I brought 2 books I wrote, one called Brexit, Why Britain Will Leave Europe, which is my analysis. I'll explain it in a second. And the other more recent ones called Let's Stay Together, Why Yes to Europe. But apparently because of some tax regulation in Athens, they can't be distributed here tonight. But I understand they will appear through your letterbox shortly. I'm sorry about that. Authors always feel happy if they've got the crutch of their books around. But Europe is a very, very tricky area for all ministers. We have an excellent new trade minister in Britain called Sajid Javid, who, like the new mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, was the son of a Pakistani bus driver. And I'm very proud that British politics can allow European Muslims in my country to rise to positions of great rank. Sajid was an investment banker before he went into politics, and he's a Secretary of State for Business and Industry. And he said, the first thing they gave me when I arrived in my office was a dossier on Europe. And it's a proposal to standardize the European packet of condoms, how many condoms, preservatives, should be in each European packet sold around European Union countries. And he said, I looked at it, and straight away there were, everybody had crazy ideas. The Germans said there should be 5. 1 for Monday, 1 for Tuesday, 1 for Wednesday, 1 for Thursday, 1 for Friday. The French said no, there should be 7. 1 for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. 1 for Saturday and 1 for Sunday. The Greeks insisted on 9. 1 for Monday, 1 for Tuesday, 1 for Wednesday, 1 for Thursday, and 2 for Saturday and 2 for Sunday. And I said, no, the British position is quite clear. There will be 12 condoms in the Euro condom packet. 1 for January, 1 for February, 1 for March. And in a sense, you have only one alternative with the European Union. You either laugh or you break down in tears. And I don't know what will happen on the 23rd of June. It is an historic moment. 100 years ago, British Royal Navy sailors were sailing out to try and sink the German fleet in the last great combined fleet engagement since the Battle of Trafalgar. It was called the Battle of Jutland. The British lost more men and ships, but the German fleet was kept in Germany, so they had to use submarines after that in warfare. And on continental Europe, there was the giant Battle of Verdun, where the French held back this huge German onslaught over 9 months and stopped the Germans advancing into France. And then in a month's time, we'll celebrate the British equivalent of that, the Battle of the Somme, where 20,000 people were killed in the first 10 minutes. That was the Europe, followed by the second great half of the European Civil War in 1939, that our parents, grandparents, some of us of an age here, maybe even as young boys, had to go through. And that's why Mrs. Thatcher in 1975, when we last had the referendum, said, the European Economic Community gives us peace and security in a free society, a peace and security denied to past generations. And she was right. And one of the sad things about our debate in Britain, it's become very personal in terms of attacks between politicians, but also very economistic in the sense of endless figures shown about how much we might lose, how much we gain, and with people frankly playing with statistics in really quite a disreputable way. And I am not sure that we'll ever get to a settled agreement on the facts of Europe, because facts are political nuggets of gold, and each person has the facts he wants. Once when I was campaigning in my own constituency, when I was an MP, and I was stopped in a general election by a man, in fact, two men. One was a white working class guy, and there was a Pakistani immigrant behind him, and the white guy said, "Can I have a word, Dennis?" And I said, yes, it's an election, I have to talk to you voters. He said, "Right then, Dennis, you think we should be in Europe, don't you?" And I said, "Well, yes, as a matter of fact, I do. I think it's very important." No, you're talking again. It's election time, Dennis. You have to listen to the voters. "Dennis, you think we should be in Europe?" "Well, yes, as a matter of fact, I think it's very important." "No, why, you're talking at me again. Will you listen? I've seen you on television. I've heard you on radio. You think we should be in Europe. Dennis, we're Yorkshire. We don't want to be in Europe." I said, okay, well, if you mean by being in Europe, being in the European community or union, we've been in it for 35, 42 years. "Oh, have we? Oh, they don't give us the facts anymore, do they?" And I'm afraid this is a comment-rich referendum campaign and a fact-free referendum campaign. But I think if we look at the three of our greatest prime ministers, all with feet of clay, all with Achilles' heels, but nonetheless the three who've certainly marked the history of my country in my lifetime, Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair. Churchill was the one who gave the impulse to the idea of European unity. He made the speeches, not just about the United States of Europe we all quote, but many, many, many others around Europe, and really lifted the horizons of the Europeans down in the dumps after the catastrophe of the 1940s. Then Margaret Thatcher, who created the Europe of shared sovereignty when she fought through what's called the Single European Act to abolish the national vetoes that stop so much effective trade, and which has given Europe a huge, huge boost in terms of its economic output. And finally, Tony Blair, who enlarged Europe. I mean, everybody who comes in thinks they might be the last member to join. That simply isn't the case. Europe has to include all of its nation states, and those even that aren't members formally of the EU, like Switzerland, where I worked for a number of years, Norway, de facto obey all of the laws, have to accept free movement, and they don't use the currency, nor does Denmark, nor does England, nor does Poland. That's less important, but they obey the rules, the values, and the directives of Europe. And I think that is good, it's healthy. Yes, we have economic problems in the Eurozone taken as a whole, but nonetheless, in the last quarter, Europe created more jobs and stronger growth than the United States. We may be turning a corner, we may not, I don't know. But I just have to say that compared to the Europe I grew up in, compared to the Greece I first visited, the Ireland I went to visit my mother's family, the Poland I went to work with the Solidarność Union in 1980, that Europe has gone forever, and thank God it's gone, because even with all the difficulties we have, and we have many difficulties, there are many more people enjoying a richer life, living in their own homes with access to healthcare, to education, and a chance for their children. Yeah, I know all of the difficulties, but if you look around the rest of the world, how many Latin Americans, how many Arab states, how many African states would die to be having even the relative unity that we've achieved here? And I think that's a very good thing. Now, it's not been accepted in my country. For the first half of my political life, until 1990, the Labour Party was anti-European. And then, like ships passing in the night, the Conservative Party became anti-European. I can explain many reasons why, maybe when we talk afterwards. But it is an extraordinary phenomenon, perhaps the result of our adversarial political system. If the Reds say 1 and 1 is 2, the Blues have to say it's 3. And then when the Blues get into power and say 2 and 2 is 4, the Reds have to say it's 5. I'm not sure exactly, but you have got a huge culture running right through both the Labour side of things and the Conservative side of things over the last 50 years, that when they're in opposition, they become hostile to Europe. They invent things. As my dear friend Boris Johnson, when he was a Daily Telegraph correspondent in Brussels in 1990s, early 1990s, and his friend, a man called James Tyndale, who's the Landale, who's now the BBC's #2 political editor, went to school with Boris and David at Eton College, and he said, he composed this little verse, "Boris tells such dreadful lies, it makes you gasp and stretch your eyes." And I'm afraid Boris has been a fabulator, an inventor, a storyteller, a poet. He's exactly like the poets of his beloved ancient Greece and Rome. He invents things, he embellishes them things, he makes them very colourful, but he doesn't really care too much about the truth. But Boris is our Donald Trump. He even goes to the same hairdresser. And one of the difficulties we face now is this rise of what I call pop-nat politics, populist nationalist politics, that always seeks to blame the immigrant, the outsider, the foreigner, the wicked Europeans, the wicked Muslims, the wicked Mexican immigrants. And it's a very negative, dangerous politics, but it is sweeping the world. You can see it in Poland, you can see it here in much, frankly, if I don't know if there are many serious friends here, but left-wing national populist politics is as dangerous as right-wing populist nationalist politics. You can see it in Germany, in France, you can see it in Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. He wants a referendum. Marine Le Pen wants a referendum. You can see it with Podemos and Izquierda Unida in Spain. And the old politics, the politics that shaped the 1945 to 2000 settlement, are really being pushed more and more into corners. And it is that politics that is pleaded for a referendum vote. I don't believe the Prime Minister had to give the referendum, but he decided that he should. His predecessor as Tory Prime Minister, John Major, said in March 2013, just after Mr. Cameron announced the referendum, he said, and I quote, "I'm not usually in favour of referendums, but I think this could have a cleansing and healing effect on British politics." Well, I don't know if any of you follow British politics at the moment. We have an open civil war in the Conservative Party, insults hurled from one Conservative to another that without precedent in my political lifetime, and I've never seen them in any other country. The Labour guys, the Liberal guys, it's like going into an Irish pub and the fight started, and you have to say, "Excuse me, is this your private fight or can anybody join in?" And as a result, the whole of this debate for the last 2 or 3 months, certainly the last 4 weeks, has been a private civil war inside the Conservative Party. And that worries me to the extent that I think voters are turned off by internal party divisions. And I'll just finish. I'm not going to get into the arguments of why I think staying in the EU is important for us economically. 45% of our exports go to Europe. Nearly all of our foreign direct investment is in London and the rest of Britain because it has access from there to the single market of 500 million middle-class consumers. I don't want to talk about geopolitical security, managing migration, tsunami waves, all of it done much better in terms of cooperation, managing environmental and global warming, which doesn't carry a national passport with them, with itself. Don't want to talk about sovereignty, though that is sensitive, though paradoxically, the people who want us out of Europe are seeking to subvert British parliamentary sovereignty by imposing a populist plebiscite as their way of getting what they want. Mrs. Thatcher called plebiscites the device of dictators and demagogues. And it's funny for me as a Labour man to be quoting Mrs. Thatcher, but she was right on that. A loss of citizenship, the right we have to travel, work. Every Greek here can go to London, go to Paris, buy a flat, start a business, travel without having a visa. I don't want that taken away from my children, but I believe that's a very real danger if we leave the EU. But let me just finish by saying, asking the question, will Brexit happen? I genuinely don't know. I hope not. The opinion polls, some done by telephone, say, no, it won't happen. Some done by online say it will. But all the pollsters have got a huge scientific problem, which is all polling is based on a previous sample. In scientific terms, it's like having a control. And there is no previous example for this. This is the first time in our history, the first time ever. So actually, I don't know. I do a lot of meetings on Brexit. I always ask for a vote at the end. Every vote I've asked for has produced a majority for Brexit. And I meet lots of friends like me who circulate in the London liberal, Brussels, pro-European elite classes, and they keep meeting people they don't expect who say they're going to vote Brexit. An awful lot of young people won't vote. 50% of all our students don't even know there's a referendum. We do know if there's a low turnout, older people will vote, and the older are much more inclined in the dream of England that once existed to vote for Brexit. It may be an a referendum in which people vote with their guts, not with their head. It may be a vote in which they give what the French call a bras d'honneur, up yours, to the elites, to Europe, to too many immigrants in the country, and we'll just tell you what we think. We didn't ask for this referendum, Mr. Cameron. That's your internal political party decision. So we're just telling you we're fed up with Europe. We're fed up with you political guys. You've been telling us Europe's been very bad for Britain for the last 20 years. We're going to vote out and you go away and sort out the problem. I don't know. Or it may be a huge 70-30% vote in favour. Maybe our distinguished speakers who follow me will be able to give you an answer. But I do say this, it will solve nothing. We will wake up on the 24th, 25th of June with the result after all the votes have been counted. If the vote is to leave, there'll be chaos and confusion for some time. There'll be a contagion effect in Europe. Marine Le Pen will be happy. Vladimir Putin will be happy. Alternative for Deutschland will be happy. Geert Wilders, True Finns, True Österreicher Freiheitspartei will be happy. And there'll be such tension because Europe is so centrifugal. I coined the term Brexit early in 2012. I think I was the first to use it. There may be other people who claim it. I don't want to boast. Because people like Simon Nixon and others were using the term Grexit about the currency. And I just switched from Grexit to Brexit. If Brexit happens, I think Grexit will follow automatically. I think Europe will start looking inside itself and lose what tiny bit of confidence it still has. If Brexit doesn't happen, it's defeated, there'll be a sigh of relief, but there won't be an answer to a single European problem. How do we liberalise our economies? How do we reform public expenditure? In France, we've got a politics incapable of delivering what the nation needs. France has got a very good administrative state, but it's got very, very poor quality politics. How do we explain to our German friends that not every country in Europe can run a net balance of trade surplus? Not every country can be an export champion. If you want to export, somebody has to import. But I've looked through the recent German, new editions of the Duden, the official German dictionary organization, and the word import doesn't appear there. The Germans think you only do exports. How to explain how to get more equilibrium into our societies and economies? Those will be the challenges if we stay in. I would love to hope that Britain could rise to those challenges. not be complaining and moaning and criticising on the fringe of Europe, which is where we've been, frankly, for too many years, Labour and Conservative alike. I'm really not making an anti-Conservative point. And we could once again, as under Churchill or Thatcher or Blair, seek to be a leading nation in Europe and find solutions to Europe's problems rather than adding to them by having this divisive and dangerous plebiscite, which may go disastrously wrong. But again, if I may, because I like to finish on a happy note, a great friend of mine, our British friends will know, called Gisela Stewart. She's a very distinguished British Member of Parliament. She came as a girl to Britain from Germany, but has had a great political career. And she's actually sporting the Leave side. But when she was standing for Parliament, for an election, 2 or 3 elections ago, somebody came up to her in her constituency of Birmingham and said, "Excuse me, Mrs. Stewart, is it true you are really a German?" And she said, "No, I've lived here all my life. I'm married to a Brit. I'm a British Minister of the Crown." No, just admit it. You're German, aren't you? "No, I've been here since I was 17. I'm British national. My children are British. I'm entirely..." "No, will you just tell the truth? You're German, aren't you?" "No, let me explain." No, Mrs. Stewart, look, don't worry. I'll be voting for you. I'll be voting Labour. You've got my vote. Because I think, it's important that Birmingham has a German MP, because we need law and order in this city. So maybe if that's the spirit that's deeper down, they won't listen to the ghastly Brexiteers and the Daily Mail and the Sun and Rupert Murdoch and all these other people who've been poisoning the wells of pro-Europeanism, and they'll listen to me. But the best thing they can do, if you've got any British friends, I've worked out, if 25 million British people bought my book, Let's Stay Together, on sale for £4.99, we'll win the election, and I'll be able to come to Greece as often as I like. Thank you all very much.
Αλλά φαίνεται ότι τεχνολογικά αξιότιμες και αξιότιμοι προσκεκλημένοι, καλησπέρα και από μένα. Μετά την πολύ σημαντική ομιλία του πρώην Υπουργού Ευρωπαϊκών Υποθέσεων, του κύριου Ντένις Μαξέιν, με την οποία οριοθετήθηκε το πλαίσιο μέσα στο οποίο αναπτύσσονται και οι ιδιομορφίες στη Μεγάλη Βρετανία και οι ιδιομορφίες μέσα στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση, και μετά τις ομιλίες των 2 προέδρων του Ελληνοβρετανικού Επιμελητηρίου, που και αυτές οριοθέτησαν το πλαίσιο μέσα στο οποίο γίνεται η σημερινή σημαντική εκδήλωση, πριν προχωρήσουμε θα ήθελα απλά να σημειώσω ότι το ζήτημα της παραμονής ή όχι της Μεγάλης Βρετανίας στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση είναι ένα ζήτημα το οποίο φεύγει πέρα από τα όρια της οικονομικο-εμπορικής ανάλυσης, πηγαίνει στη γεωπολιτική, στην πολιτική, στη θεσμική και θα έλεγα ακόμα και στην πολιτιστική. Επίσης, θα ήθελα να υπενθυμίσω ότι η σημερινή συζήτηση γίνεται με αυτό που λέμε καταναλογίαν όρους Βρετανικού Κοινοβουλίου. Υπάρχουν 2 ομιλητές οι οποίοι θα υποστηρίξουν την άποψη ότι η Μεγάλη Βρετανία πρέπει να παραμείνει στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση και 2 ομιλητές που θα κάνουν ακριβώς το αντίθετο. Θα υπάρχει χρόνος ο οποίος είναι 10 λεπτά συν 2 λεπτά ανοχής, έτσι ώστε να μπορέσουν να αναπτυχθούν τα επιχειρήματα. First speaker in this debate, Mr. Simon Nixon, who is the chief European commentator of the Wall Street Journal, well known to all of you, not only through his comments and tweets on the Greek crisis, but also on his invaluable analysis of European politics and also of the whereabouts of what is happening in the crucial European institutions. Mr. Nixon, you have the floor.
A city I've got to know and love over the last few years when I've been coming here regularly to when it seemed that Greece was at the very heart of the future of Europe, or the future of Europe was being determined here in Athens. And so it's a very odd feeling to be here now to discuss my own country, where it seems that the future of Europe is being determined in the UK. Can I also say that it's great, my thanks to the British Hellenic Chamber of Commerce for inviting me. The BHCC has spent, since 1945, the BHCC has been nurturing Anglo-Hellenic relations, and especially in the commercial sphere. But of course, I think it's important to start by acknowledging that the Anglo-Greek relationship goes back a lot further than 1945. The UK was one of the earliest supporters of Greek independence. The 1830 protocol that it first internationally recognized the Hellenic Republic was, of course, signed in London, agreed in London. The UK supported Greece through 2 Balkan wars, and of course was also a supporter of Greece in its the ambitions of the great idea in Anatolia, and the catastrophe that followed led to the downfall of a British Prime Minister, Lloyd George, and the collapse of one of our historic parties, the Liberal Party. The UK and Greece fought together in the Second World War. So Britain and Greece have been very closely involved in each other's history for nearly 200 years. And Britain and Greece continue to be strongly intertwined even today through the last few years of crisis in Europe. Although the UK is not part of the Eurozone and in a sense has been a political bystander during the Greek crises of the last 6 years, the UK has been an important player in other respects in that crisis. In particular, for example, the UK press of the left and the right has been a very vocal supporter of Greece's various confrontations with its creditors. And I have to say, not always for the most altruistic of reasons. For the left, often for the British left, the Greek crisis was often a proxy war for fighting against austerity in the UK. And for the Eurosceptic right, the Greek crisis was also a proxy war for its own battles over trying to take Britain out of the EU. But even so, Greece has been an important. The UK helped set the international opinion. The UK media helped set the international climate in which the Greek crisis has played out, and now that favour is being returned. because Greece is right at the heart of the Brexit campaign today. No Eurosceptic speech goes, but you rarely have a Eurosceptic speech in which Greece isn't mentioned. But depending on which day of the week it is, or which Eurosceptic, which particular Eurosceptic or Brexit leader is speaking, the Greek crisis is taken as an example that the EU is either an evil superstate that is out to crush national democracies, or that it's about to become an evil superstate because that's the only way to keep the euro together, or that the EU is just a doomed failed project altogether that's about to bring down every economy in Europe, including that of the UK. So the Greek crisis is a theme that's been running, Greece is a theme that's been running through the UK debate. And why do I raise all this? So why do I raise all this history? I think it's important to raise this history because I think it's important to recognize that what happens in Greece has an impact in the UK, and what happens in the UK has an impact in Greece. The two countries may be the furthest apart geographically in Europe, but it's impossible for the two countries to separate their interests. I think that at the heart of the Brexit debate and the Greek crisis were essentially the same two questions. What is the EU for, and where is it going? Because if the EU's doing the wrong things and going in the wrong direction, then clearly there's no point in either country being part of it. And I think that before one discusses economics or migration or trade or all that, one has to answer those two fundamental questions. And at the heart of the Brexit case is this idea that the EU is somehow a superstate or about to become a superstate, and that is a great threat to British sovereignty and to Britain's interests. And I have to say that as somebody who spends my working life traveling around Europe, talking to policymakers and politicians and business leaders, trade union people, finance people, I've got to say I don't come across anybody who thinks that the EU either is or should become a superstate. There may have been federalists, European federalists at the outset of the project in the 1950s, and there may be even somewhere lurking in Brussels a couple of true believers still today, but I've yet to meet them. I don't meet them in Berlin, I don't meet them in Paris, I don't meet them in Madrid or Lisbon. I don't think I've met them here in Greece either. What I see when I go around Europe is the EU as, what I see is 28 sovereign democracies trying to tackle common problems. And that the EU is a mechanism by which those countries can find common solutions to common problems. And back in the in the early days of the project, those problems were how to rebuild a war-torn Europe, how to bring democracy and strong institutions to the countries of Europe. But the challenges today are challenges like migration, terrorism, Russian aggression, climate change, energy security, slow growth, the economic challenges that come from demographics and technological change. And Brexit won't do anything to to help manage any of those crises. If Britain leaves the EU, there will still be a migration crisis, there'll still be terrorism challenges, there'll still be growth challenges, and all of those crises will continue to be a threat to Britain and to Greece. So, so the difference is that, but in the past, these common challenges, that Europe has always faced these common challenges. Long before the internet or TV or mass tourism, there have always been these common challenges, as Britain and Greece's entwined history shows. The difference is that the EU provides a mechanism by which to try and manage those through the rule of law and through political compromises and consensus seeking. And yes, it's cumbersome, but that's not because it's a superstate, but because actually it's 28 democracies. It's difficult. It's really hard. Democracy and sovereignty of nations is at the heart of it. That makes it hard to find solutions. But I would say that the EU is still a useful mechanism. It is still a valuable way of trying to manage the continent's problems. We've had, in the last 6 years, we've seen the EU develop bailout funds, banking union, the Commission trying to cut red tape. We've seen the deepening of the single market in energy, digital services. We've seen the creation of new investment funds. We're looking, the EU is now trying to find common solutions in the area of cross-border terrorism, instability in the Mediterranean. The EU's operating in Somalia, trying to deal with piracy there. The EU has operated in the area of climate change. These are all common problems to which the EU is finding common solutions. And the UK has a lot to offer the EU in all of these areas. It led, as Dennis mentioned earlier, it led the expansion of the creation of the single market. It's been one of the prime movers in the expansion of Europe to Eastern Europe. So there's much that the UK has to offer, still to offer the EU. But Brexit isn't a solution to any of the problems, any of these cross-border problems that I just discussed. What's really driving Brexit is not really the failure of the EU, but the success of the UK. The single market. The UK has been the single biggest beneficiary of the creation of the single market and of the euro. And the way in which you can see that, what you have seen as a result of those in the last 25 years, is the UK emerge as Europe's financial centre, as the centre of Europe's creative industries. The UK has emerged as the most important centre for services in the EU. The UK, at the centre of the Brexit debate, is what's considered the problem of the free movement of people, of too many, in the views of the Brexit campaign, too many people coming to the UK. But I like to look at it the other way around. The flip side of the free movement of people is the free movement of jobs. Jobs that might once have been done in Athens or Spain are now being done in the UK. And of course, it's only right that the people as part of the compromise of the creation of the single market, that people from Greece and Spain should be able to go and do those jobs in the UK. I don't think there's, but of course the flip side of that is that from Greece's point of view, the opposite is the case. Greece has not been so successful in the EU and in a single market. But that's not because there's some flaw in the EU. It's primarily because of flaws in Greece's own economic model. And the free movement of people has been actually a very important factor for Greece in its crisis. If it wasn't for the fact that many young Greeks and many Greeks have been able to go and take jobs elsewhere in the EU, then what may already be a lost generation would be far more lost. The ability of people to go and acquire skills and work overseas is an important part of the EU, what the EU can offer a country as it adapts its own economic model. So I don't see that Brexit or Grexit is being a solution to any problem at all. The real solution to the problems, the solution to Britain's problems with the solution to Britain's problems of success are not to make Britain less successful, but to find ways to build the houses and build the public services that are needed. And similarly for Greece, the solutions to Greece's challenges are to adapt the economic model and to become more successful. So I would just say, to conclude, that for me the biggest threat to the stability of Europe is Brexit itself. When David Cameron warned of this the other day, that the European stability might be put at risk, he was roundly ridiculed by the British media and accused of stoking Project Fear. But Michael Gove, who is regarded as the intellectual brains behind the Brexit operation, was quite clear about the consequences of Brexit. He said that there would be contagion, and he welcomed that. He said that there would be the end of the euro and the EU, and that would be a good thing. So he wants to liberate Europe. And I think you should be people in Greece, if I want one message for people in Greece from this debate, I think that you should be aware that the Brexit campaign are not Greece's friends. They want to push Europe into chaos, and Greece will be one of the biggest losers from that chaos. So I would just say, I would appeal to 200 years of shared Anglo-Greek history and say that the security and prosperity of all of Europe is at risk, and that it may well be that the Greek people are the one people in Europe that can have that can influence this debate, and I would urge people in Greece to let your voices be heard in the UK debate before it's too late. Thank you.
Ευχαριστούμε τον κύριο Σάιμον Νίξον για την πραγματικά πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα παρέμβασή του, μέσα από την οποία αναδείχθηκαν μία σειρά από επιχειρήματα που στηρίζουν την άποψη ότι η Μεγάλη Βρετανία πρέπει να παραμείνει στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση, τόσο επιχειρήματα τόσο από την πλευρά των ευρωπαϊκών πολιτικών, όσο και από την πλευρά των βρετανικών συμφερόντων. Επόμενος ομιλητής, ο δημοσιογράφος και συγγραφέας, κύριος Ιαν Μάρτιν, ο οποίος ήταν για πολύ μεγάλο χρονικό διάστημα αρχισυντάκτης της εφημερίδας Scotsman, αλλά που επίσης συνεργάζεται με πολλές εφημερίδες, όπως για παράδειγμα η Telegraph, η Financial Times, αλλά και το βασικότερο είναι συγγραφέας αρκετών βιβλίων. Mr. Martin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to contribute to this debate in these extraordinary surroundings. And I'm also particularly grateful because we are conscious, most of us in Britain, that our taste for introspection on the European question does rather risk boring or even annoying our friends and neighbours in the other parts of Europe. So thank you for your patience and thank you for taking the time to actually listen to a pair of Brits, Simon Nixon, my old friend, and Dennis McShane, bang on about Europe again. And I think, I mean, let's face it, from the start, the Brits have always had a curious relationship with the European project. We were reluctant entrants in the 1970s because we felt that our economy was broken and that we needed to copy the European model. And ever since then, the British have become the #1 country in Europe for complaining. It's what we're best at. We are world leaders when it comes to moaning about the European Union. But the joy is now, finally, at last, after decades of moaning, the Brits really have to put up or shut up. The Brits have to make a decision. Are they going to stick with, as I'm going to argue, a broken down model and leave the European Union, or stick with it and carry on boring the rest of Europe with our complaints forevermore? And I must admit that I'm a reluctant Brexiteer. I didn't necessarily expect to be arguing the case for Britain leaving the European Union. I hoped that the Prime Minister, David Cameron's attempts to renegotiate our arrangements with the European Union would result in something that really delivered and allowed me and people like me to advocate for staying in a reformed EU. I also don't like most of the highly nationalistic, nativist rhetoric that comes from quite a lot of Brexiteers. I'm thinking particularly of, you may have heard of the UK Independence Party and the infamous Nigel Farage. And they have a way of talking about Europe that I reject. I was with one of them recently who said to me, well, you're like me, you're British, you're not European. To which I responded, well, I am British, I'm Scottish as well, but I am European. Europe and the European Union are not necessarily the same thing. The UK cannot leave Europe. Europe is a geographical and cultural fact. And our shared culture, very conscious of saying this particularly in Greece, is one of the glories of human civilization and human advancement. At stake in the British referendum, really, is whether the European Union, as currently constituted and developed, is serving Europe well. And I've concluded with regret that the EU doesn't serve Britain well And just as importantly, it doesn't serve the rest of Europe particularly well either. First, in Britain, you hear a lot of talk about how this is all about immigration and that this is inherently terrible and that millions of voters in Britain are adopting a racist position when they say that they're particularly concerned about free movement and about immigration. But Britain is a country which has thrived on immigration. The world is on the move. There is going to be lots of immigration in the decades to come as globalization takes its next twist. But Britain used to pretty much had around 50,000, a sort of settled migratory flow, net immigration of around 50,000. Even that brought some cultural tensions, but Britain, to its credit, after some fairly shameful episodes, adapted well and has benefited from immigration. But the figures, as revealed last week, show that net immigration is running at 330,000. So the voters who are very, very concerned about this are not adopting a racist position. They are worried about the pressure on public services. They are worried about cultural cohesion. And if the EU was a sensible project that was prepared to learn and adapt properly, it would have accepted by now that the lesson of the last few years is that the concept of freedom of movement itself, which is a very, very nice idea, which was dreamt up by a small number of states, when applied to a continent of 500 million people and the EU with 28 members, is a recipe for disaster, and it has helped to fuel the rise of the populist right. So, and I would argue that not only is the EU model as currently constituted not in Britain's interest, it's not working for the rest of Europe either. On the two most basic criteria of what you would expect a power bloc to do and to deliver, whether it wants to be an empire or not, whether it just wants to be a loose confederation of cooperating states, you would place pretty high economics and currency. And what is the lesson of the last 10 years? A catastrophe inflicted on the peoples, particularly of southern Europe, in pursuit of a dream which many people warned at the time would have precisely those effects. The other thing that you might expect an emerging empire, or as I say, loose confederation, to be good at if it wants to succeed and carry the popular will with it, is protecting its external borders and having a serious policy for its internal borders. So my hope is that if on June the 23rd, Britain votes for self-government, I don't see it in narrowly British terms. It is my hope, my wish, that it should act as a catalyst for a wake-up call for the rest of the European Union. And in essence, it should not be beyond the wit and wisdom of the many smart people on this great continent to devise a way in which we can retain control of our borders. Our democracies will function as proper, coherent democracies, but we trade and cooperate together. That is, in essence, what lots of Brits thought that they were signing up for in the early 1970s, and in the last referendum in 1975. So it's for that reason that I advocate Brexit, not just because I think that Britain would benefit hugely, and I think that the risks to trade are massively exaggerated. Free markets are dynamic. People respond to new situations. Trade deals can be done. It is in the interest of both parties. Britain, which, as I pointed out, is not leaving Europe. It is choosing to have a different relationship with the European Union. It should be possible for people of goodwill to construct a new settlement. So, in conclusion, I advocate Brexit because I think it will lead to a stronger, more self-confident Britain, and you also, as a bonus, our friends and neighbours in the rest of Europe won't have to listen to quite so much British complaining and moaning, which is not just restricted to the weather, obviously. It's our second favourite subject is the EU. But it could also mean a stronger, reformed Europe. So my pitch on Brexit is somewhat unusual on the Brexit side, but I say it as a proud European. Vote Brexit for the sake of Britain, but also for the sake of a greater Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martin. Νομίζω ότι με την παρέμβασή του, με αυτό τον νηφάλιο τρόπο, έγιναν πιο σαφείς οι θέσεις όσων υποστηρίζουν ότι η Μεγάλη Βρετανία πρέπει να εγκαταλείψει την Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση. Επόμενος ομιλητής που θα στηρίξει την άποψη ότι η Μεγάλη Βρετανία πρέπει να παραμείνει στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση, ο καθηγητής κύριος Σπύρος Φλογαΐτης, διευθυντής του EPLO, European Public Law Organization. Κύριε Φλογαΐτη, έχετε τον λόγο.
Ευχαριστώ κύριε Πρόεδρε. Θα μιλήσω στα ελληνικά γιατί δεν νομίζω ότι σε ένα Έλληνα επιτρέπεται να μιλήσει διαφορετικά σε αυτή την αίθουσα. Πώς θα καθίσω για να μην σας έχω πίσω μου. Κυρίες και κύριοι, πριν από μερικές εβδομάδες ήμουν ανάμεσα στο Λονδίνο και το Cambridge και ρώτησα πολλούς από τους ανθρώπους που συνάντησα πότε θα γίνει το ρεφερέντουμ. Ανθρώπους απλούς, ανθρώπους σπουδαίους. Μου έκανε μεγάλη εντύπωση ότι κανείς δεν ήξερε την ημερομηνία. Κάποιοι μου είπανε τέλος Μάη, κάποιοι άλλοι μου είπανε τέλος Ιουνίου. Αλλά μου έκανε μεγάλη εντύπωση, γιατί σε έναν Έλληνα αυτό δεν νομίζω ότι θα συνέβαινε ποτέ, να μην ξέρει πότε θα γίνει το ρεφερέντουμ. Έλαβα το λόγο για να υποστηρίξω ότι η Μεγάλη Βρετανία δεν μπορεί να φύγει από την Ευρώπη, διότι η ιστορία της και ο ρόλος της στον κόσμο δεν της το επιτρέπουν. Και θέλω να ελπίζω ότι ο λαός θα ψηφίσει σύμφωνα με τον τρόπο που εγώ τουλάχιστον αντιλαμβάνομαι τη χώρα τους. Σας θυμίζω το έτος 1453. Για μας τους Έλληνες είναι μια χρονιά που σηματοδοτεί την πτώση της Κωνσταντινούπολης. Το 1453 όμως είναι και το τέλος του πολέμου των 100 ετών, του πολέμου των Ρόδων. Για 100 χρόνια οι Πλανταγενέτες, οι οποίοι βασίλευαν στο Λονδίνο, προσπαθούσαν να κρατήσουν την παρουσία τους και για μεγάλα χρονικά διαστήματα την είχαν εξασφαλίσει στην περιοχή της Γαλλίας. Η μισή Γαλλία ήταν για τόσα πολλά χρόνια αγγλική, ώστε ακόμα σήμερα στο Μπορντό η ανώτερη τάξη χρησιμοποιεί αγγλικά ονόματα για τα παιδιά της. Θα σας θυμίσω τον Jack Lang, τον Υπουργό Πολιτισμού της Γαλλίας, ο οποίος λέγονταν Jack, δεν λέγονταν Jacques. 100 χρόνια πολέμου, γιατί είναι βαθιά στο μυαλό της Αγγλίας ότι η ενδοχώρα της είναι η ηπειρωτική Ευρώπη. Άλλωστε, το 1066 μετά Χριστόν, ο Γουλιέλμος ο Νόθος, ο Γουλιέλμος ο κατακτητής, που είναι δούκας της Νορμανδίας, επεκτείνει το βασίλειό του στην Αγγλία και οι Πλανταγενέτες είναι βασιλιάδες της Αγγλίας και βασάλοι του βασιλιά της Γαλλίας στη Γαλλία. Γι' αυτό έγινε και ο εκατονταετής πόλεμος. Όταν αργότερα το 1618 με 1648 έγινε ο 30ετής πόλεμος, παρότι η αγγλική παρουσία δεν ήταν τόσο μεγάλη, ήταν όμως παρουσία η οποία επηρέασε τα πράγματα. Έλαβαν μέρος οι Άγγλοι στον 30ετή πόλεμο, παρότι επρόκειτο για πόλεμο ο οποίος εξελίχθηκε κυρίως στα εδάφη που σήμερα είναι γνωστά ως η Γερμανία. Η μέρα όμως που ήταν η σπουδαιότερη για τους Άγγλους και την πολιτική τους στην Ευρώπη είναι η μέρα που ο Wellington συντρίβει τον Ναπολέοντα το 1815 στο Βατερλό. Το Βατερλό εξακολουθεί μέχρι σήμερα να κυβερνάει την Ευρώπη, διότι μέχρι το Βατερλό κυριαρχούσε στην Ευρώπη η άποψη των Γάλλων και των άλλων δυνάμεων της υπηρετικής Ευρώπης για continental rule. Ο Ναπολέον ήθελε να κυβερνήσει στην υπηρετική Ευρώπη και μπορούσε η Αγγλία να καθίσει ήσυχα στην άκρη. Μπορούσε να ανακαλύψει όλο τον κόσμο, μπορούσε να γίνει σπουδαία, αλλά the continent θα ήταν για τους λαούς της υπηρετικής Ευρώπης. Όμως το 1815 ο Wellington συνέτριψε την αρχή του continental rule και από τότε δεν ξαναγυρίσαμε σε αυτό ποτέ. Προσπάθησε να επαναφέρει το continental rule ο Χίτλερ και συνετρίβει κι αυτός, επειδή οι Άγγλοι πήραν στην πλάτη τους αυτή την ιστορία και κερδίσανε το Δεύτερο Παγκόσμιο Πόλεμο. Είχαν κερδίσει προηγουμένως και τον Πρώτο Παγκόσμιο Πόλεμο. Υπόθηκε προηγουμένως ότι αυτοί οι δύο πόλεμοι, ο Πρώτος και ο Δεύτερος Παγκόσμιος Πόλεμος, αποτελούν μια παρακαταθήκη για την Αγγλία και για την παρουσία της στην Ευρώπη, από την οποία η Αγγλία δεν μπορεί και δεν πρέπει ποτέ να ξεφύγει. Το ενδιαφέρον είναι ότι όταν δημιουργήθηκε η Ευρώπη, οι ευρωπαϊκές κοινότητες, η Ευρώπη των 6, επανήλθαμε στο continental rule. Η Ευρώπη των 6 ήταν η Ευρώπη του Καρολομάγνου και η Αγγλία ήταν απ' έξω. Είναι πολύ ενδιαφέρον αυτό, αλλά δεν κράτησε. Και δεν κράτησε, δεν μπορούσε να κρατήσει. Δεν μπορούσε να κρατήσει διότι η Αγγλία είχε κάνει πολλές θυσίες για να είναι παρούσα στην Ευρώπη και θα προσέθετα ότι η Ευρώπη, το σύστημα αξιών που λέμε Ευρώπη, το σύστημα των πολιτικών που αποκαλούμε Ευρώπη, είναι κατά 80% δημιούργημα της Μεγάλης Βρετανίας. Το σύστημα των αξιών με το οποίο ζούμε έχει βέβαια τις ρίζες του στην αρχαία Ελλάδα και στη Ρώμη. Σας θυμίζω όμως ότι το μεγαλείο της Μεγάλης Γαλλικής Επανάστασης του 1789 είναι ότι πήρε την πολιτική φιλοσοφία της Αγγλίας και τη μετέτρεψε σε κάτι το οποίο ήταν περισσότερο στα δικά μας μέτρα εμάς των Ευρωπαίων της υπηρετικής Ευρώπης. Αλλά η μήτρα είναι αγγλική. Αυτοί επενόησαν την αρχή του rule of law και εμείς την κάναμε αρχή του κράτους δικαίου με τα δικά μας λόγια, είτε στη Γαλλία, είτε στη Γερμανία, είτε σε όλο τον κόσμο. Κυρίες και κύριοι, κλείνοντας την παρέμβασή μου, θέλω να πω όμως ένα λόγο παραπάνω. Βλέποντας τη σημερινή Ευρώπη, αυτή την οποία καλείται ο Βρετανός ψηφοφόρος να δεχθεί ή να απορρίψει, δεν μπορεί να μην μας έρθει στο μυαλό το ερώτημα τελικά γιατί πολεμήσαμε στο Δεύτερο Παγκόσμιο Πόλεμο. Αναφέρθηκε ότι Οι Άγγλοι πολέμησαν δίπλα στους Έλληνες. Εγώ έχω πει πολλές φορές ότι εμείς οι ταπεινοί, οι ξυπόλοιτοι Έλληνες, πολεμήσαμε δίπλα στους Άγγλους. Και πολεμήσαμε, ίσως είμαστε η μόνη μικρή χώρα της Ευρώπης, αλλά και από τις μεγάλες το ίδιο συμβαίνει, είμαστε οι μόνοι οι οποίοι πολεμήσαμε και δεν παραδοθήκαμε ποτέ, πολεμήσαμε στο Ελαλαμέιν, στο Ρίμινι, είμαστε στην Ορμανδία με τους Άγγλους. Μήπως κάναμε λάθος? Εάν οι Άγγλοι νομίζουν ότι έχουν δικαίωμα να φύγουν από την Ευρώπη, αφού εμείς οι ξυπόλοιτοι τους πιστέψαμε και πολεμήσαμε μαζί τους, νομίζω ότι κάνουν πολύ μεγάλο λάθος. Θέλω να καταλήξω λέγοντας ότι χρειαζόμαστε μια άλλη Ευρώπη και η Μεγάλη Βρετανία μπορεί να βοηθήσει ώστε αυτή η άλλη Ευρώπη να γεννηθεί. Αυτό είναι η υποχρέωσή τους. Αυτό καταλαβαίνω ότι πρέπει να είναι το αποτέλεσμα που θα βγει από την κάλπη σε λίγες μέρες στη Μεγάλη Βρετανία. Δεν δικαιούνται από την ιστορία τους, αλλά και από τις θυσίες μικρών λαών, αλλά ιστορικών λαών όπως η Ελλάδα, δεν δικαιούνται να σκεφτούν διαφορετικά. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Να ευχαριστήσω τον καθηγητή, τον κύριο Φλογαΐτη, για την πραγματικά πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα παρέμβασή του και για την μεθοδολογική προσέγγιση, όπου μέσα από μια σειρά από ιστορικά γεγονότα κατέδειξε τους λόγους για τους οποίους η Μεγάλη Βρετανία πρέπει να παραμείνει στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση. Ο κύριος Οικονομόπουλος έχει ζητήσει το λόγο.
Ήθελα απλώς να καλωσορίσω τον πρόεδρο της Ένωσης Κεντρών, τον κύριο Βασίλη Λεβέντη, που μας τιμά με την παρουσία του.
Ευχαριστώ. Last but not least, Dr. Mariano Davis, who is the president of the British Chamber of Commerce in Denmark. Mr. Davis will defend the position that Great Britain should leave the European Union. Mr. Davis, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And may I first say, as I look around this such honourable building, where I'm really looking at the birthplace of oratory and rhetoric in Europe as we know it, it is an enormous honour and an honour that I don't take lightly. I'd like to start by just reminding myself, why did I support my Prime Minister, Edward Heath, in 1972 when he brought us into the European Economic Union, the EEC. I was a student at the time, and I was passionately burning for Europe. I think the two main issues that we saw as we moved into a new era of the United Kingdom nearing its both financial and security with Europe were perhaps those two very words: finance, economics, and security. Let me take a quick time out there. As we are debating in this prestigious house today, today's actually been a very, very important day in the history of British-German relations. Some of you may know that today is the centenary of the Battle of Jutland. Actually, nothing to do with the Danes. It just happened to take place off the coast of Jutland, and on the coast they could hear the battle take place between the German Admiralty and the British Admiralty. It's issues like this and the whole scenario of the First and Second World War that very much is at the back of our minds also, as well as the economic issues that took us into the EEC. Today, on this very day, 100 years after this battle took place on the 31st of May 1916, the grandson of Admiral Scherer, the German admiral, and the grandson of Admiral Jellicoe, the British admiral, are in Denmark at a very big activity that the Royal Navy and the German Parliament has put together so that these two young men could shake hands. I think the reason I mention this, I think it's indicative of how we as a continent, the British Isles and the European continent, have taken great steps now to move together towards a future. I don't think that future is necessarily limited to what we are seeing now take place in Brussels. I'm going to walk you through a few simple examples, maybe not simple, but a few examples of why perhaps a large number of people in the UK today see a better United Kingdom, not moving necessarily away from Europe, but actually, potentially through a Brexit, moving closer to Europe. Let me give you some examples. One of the most spoken of areas in the UK Leave campaign are the EU tariffs and non-tariff barriers. These are very much built to protect agriculture and manufacturing. These are two very big areas, but unfortunately not necessarily the most important areas for the UK. The UK is a country which has developed its present position of being perhaps one of the most successful examples of GDP growth in Europe, besides Poland, through services and financial services. I think there is a danger that, seen again from a British point of view, that the common agricultural policy, which by the way represents 3%, just 3% of the EU economy, is actually 40% of the EU budget. Now, there may be very good reasons for doing this, but again, seen from the Leave campaign's point of view, one of the problems is that this 40% of the EU budget is actually going to the large businesses in the agricultural sector, and it's not helping startups, SMEs, where perhaps we see the innovation for the future. Just one example. Let me dwindle a little longer on the issue of financial services. I don't think there are many people today who would disagree with me when I say that London has become the financial capital of the world. Yes, that has a lot to do with Britain's closeness to the EU, but what we have been seeing over later years is more and more over-regulation, which again the Leave campaign would propose could be threatening Britain's position as the financial capital of the world. And by the way, the Remain campaign is suggesting that if Britain was to leave the EU, Britain would no longer be the financial capital of the world. Well, we in the Leave campaign just don't believe that. I think Britain would continue to support its friends in Europe, Greece being one of them, and I don't think there would actually be any changes, because it wouldn't be logical to create any great change. So that's one particularly strong issue as an example, the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy. Let me take another. Britain, the UK, is a net contributor to the EU budget. Yes, this has advantages. I've heard other speakers today, particularly, well, actually one from either side, the Remain and the Leave campaign, speak about the UK as, well, almost the naughty boy of Europe. I would maintain that Britain really has been the prefect in the class, you know, trying very hard to keep the EU, the European Economic Community that we joined, on track. If we look at the gross contribution that we made in 2014, this is an approximate amount, it was 20 billion British pounds, 20 billion pounds. It's worth remembering that perhaps one of the most difficult periods in our history as the so-called naughty boy of Europe was the Thatcher era, where after much debate, it was recognized under the Fontainebleau rebate in 1984 that Britain should receive 66% of its rebate, 66% back of its contribution as a rebate. And that has been phased out here to 2011. So clearly there has been a recognition that perhaps the ideology of what we went to in 1972 hasn't been working out. I'd like to also leave you 2 or 3 last issues, and then I'll round up. First of all, the Remain campaign would like to point out that 45% of Britain's GDP is export to the EU. The Leave campaign, and there are well-known economists behind these figures, would maintain that 12% of British GDP is accounted for as export. 12%, not 45%, as export to the EU. Yet the remaining 88% of British export to the rest of the world is strangled by the regulation or the over-regulation, seen from the Leave campaign's point of view, of the EU. So there are definitely issues here that need to be addressed. A couple of final figures worth bearing in mind as we now debate this issue. If we look over the last 5 years, let's take a well-known organization like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund has been looking at the percentage rate of change in constant price GDP, okay, constant price GDP. According to the IMF, over the last 5 years, the accumulative GDP level of the US has been 12%. Japan, somewhat lower, 4.9%. These are countries that we compare ourselves to. Canada, 9.3%. Australia, 14.5%. Hong Kong, 13.1%. And Singapore, 16.9%. Nevertheless, in the euro area, the same figure is 2.9. And within the European Union, it's 5.2. So there are clearly issues here that we need to consider with regard to this EU project. And may I also here, as I round up, point out that if you look at the lowest rates of unemployment in Europe, Iceland, 3.2%, Norway, 4.5%, and Switzerland, 3.7%. I needn't tell you here in Greece what your unemployment rate is. Portugal, 12.2%, and Spain, 20.5%. Maybe the UK could actually be of greater benefit to the EU if it was actually outside the EU and could realize its true potential. So, ladies and gentlemen, I leave you with the thought that the Leave campaign is not about punishing Europe, but perhaps helping Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davis, for this illuminating speech. Με την ομιλία του κυρίου Ντέιβις ολοκληρώνεται η συζήτηση. Να ευχαριστήσω και τους 4 ομιλητές, οι οποίοι με επιχειρήματα και από την ιστορία της Ευρώπης και από την καθημερινότητα των πολιτών και από τις μεγάλες συζητήσεις στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση και στη Μεγάλη Βρετανία για τα μεγάλα ζητήματα που απασχολούν την Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση, στήριξαν ένθεν κακήθεν τις θέσεις τους και κατέδειξαν φυσικά το πόσο κρίσιμο είναι το επικείμενο δημοψήφισμα. Να ευχαριστήσω για τη συνεργασία και να παραδώσω τη σκητάλη στον κύριο Παύλο Τσίμα για το επόμενο στάδιο αυτής της εκδήλωσης.
I'm taking over from an old friend from our university years. This is now the second act is mainly Q&A, questions and answers, your questions and answers. But first, a brilliant colleague of mine, Yannis Paleologos from Kathimerini, a journalist and writer, will make his comments, and the speakers have the right to reply to these comments. Yanni.
Thank you very much, Pavlo, and thank you very much to the British Hellenic Chamber of Commerce for inviting me to this event. I'm going to make some very brief comments comparing last year's exercise in direct democracy here in Greece with what's going to happen this year in the UK. It seems there's something about the fair, well-spoken days of early summer that brings about a renewed passion for direct democracy in some EU leaders, and it may seem to some rash or foolhardy to stake major strategic commitments of one's country on the mood of the electorate on one specific day. But this is what Mr. Tsipras and Mr. Cameron, in their separate ways, elected to do. Greece's referendum last year on July 5, the object of which is nebulous to this day, and the British referendum on continued membership or not of the European Union are similar in interesting ways and also different in interesting ways, and I'll try to talk about both, but the differences in particular are important. The differences in terms of the seriousness of the process in the two countries, I think, are like day or night, or for those of us here, and I think it's most of us who are well acquainted with both Greece and the UK, I would say they're as different as a radiant blue morning in June in the Aegean and a drizzly cold November evening in London. So, I'll begin with the similarities. It seems to me that both the British Prime Minister and the Greek Prime Minister were, in a sense, forced into the choice of a referendum to deal with intra-party political pressures. Mr. Cameron became leader of the Tory party, promising and pledging to stop banging on about Europe, but of course he came into power in 2010 leading the most Eurosceptic parliamentary group in the modern history of the Tory party. He resisted initially the idea of the referendum. He came out against it, I believe, in 2011. But by 2013, he had changed course and had promised that in the first half of his second term, if re-elected, he would hold a referendum on the in-and-out question. So, in effect, Mr. Cameron laid the integrity of the EU and also of the UK on the line, because many people suspect that if it's a leave vote, then Scotland will hold another referendum and probably this time vote for independence. He laid all this on the line in order to deal with the Eurosceptic furies within the Tory party. Mr. Tsipras, other things equal, faced a similar situation in late June last year. Having promised the moon and the stars to the Greek people before the January election, he came to a point where he realized that the choice was between succumbing to the demands of the creditors or taking the country out of the Eurozone. On June 22nd last year, he made an offer of an austerity package which was almost 8 billion euros in size for 2015 and 2016, almost exclusively new taxes. And he thought this was going over many of his red lines, things he had promised he would never do. And he thought this would finally lead to a deal between Greece and its creditors and stave off a default. When the details of this proposal came out, the parliamentary party of Syriza, his party, there was enormous unrest in it because, after all, these people had been elected to end austerity, to end humiliating bailout reviews, and now they were going to be called upon to vote for more of the same. So, in a sense, when the creditors sent the proposal back on the Wednesday, suddenly remembering that overtaxation produces recessionary effects, this was the last straw for the young Greek Prime Minister. He decided to go for the referendum and to call on the Greek people to vote no. And this made him, again, the darling of his party and also made him the object of adoration for millions of Greeks, which was all wonderful. The minor hitch was that the referendum caused capital controls and a bank holiday. It led to a default on the IMF. And the no vote on the Sunday, of course, brought the country to the very brink of a Eurozone exit. The other significant similarity, which Dennis alluded to earlier, is the fact that in the Greek vote, and I suspect in the British vote as well, there is a great deal of influence and strength in anti-elite and anti-EU feeling. And I think, we can be... we can think of this in different ways, but it's important to realize that it is a symptom of the failures of the EU and of mainstream parties to deal with the challenges of globalization, migration, etc., and especially to deal with the terrible effects of the world financial crisis of 2008, which we're still basically living through. But to come to the differences that I spoke of earlier, the Greek referendum was announced by the Prime Minister after midnight on June 27, 2015, and the vote was held on July 5. The deliberation period on this issue of massive importance for the future of Greece was basically 8 days. Laws that called for a longer pre-election period were changed through legislative decree, and the Parliament was only involved in ratifying that after the fact. The question itself was extremely technical. It was on the latest proposal by the creditors, which was very similar to Mr. Tsipras' own proposal. And of course, the proposal was no longer valid after June 30th, when the Greek program actually expired. All these issues made for a very problematic process, which the Council of Europe, in fact, criticized, saying it didn't meet minimum standards for a proper referendum. But of course, even worse than that, for someone who takes the verdict of the people seriously, is the fact that the Greek Prime Minister went on to completely ignore the triumphant no vote, the 61% that voted against the measures. Now, my personal view is that it was the salvation of Greece, the fact that he completely changed his mind, but it's still the case that, he held a referendum, he advised people to vote one way, they voted that way, and then he went a week later and brought a deal that was much tougher than what he had called on the people to reject. So, in many ways, this referendum in Greece was a travesty, but a travesty with terrible economic consequences, and also a bitter legacy of division sown by the government itself. The Brits have done things quite a bit differently. As I mentioned earlier, the referendum was announced as early as January 2013. The precise date was set last February. Both camps had time to, the question was clear and even-handed. Both camps had time to, prepare, set up dedicated websites. There were public and television debates. And of course, Mr. Cameron, unlike Mr. Tsipras, does not have leeway to ignore the result. In fact, according to some interpretations, a no vote a leave vote will count as effective notification under Article 2, Clause 2 of Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, which governs the withdrawal of a member state. So Mr. Cameron cannot turn a no into a yes like Mr. Tsipras did. On a final note, and I'll be very brief about this because Simon spoke about this, last year there was a curious alliance between the leftist government of Greece and the Eurosceptic right in the UK, and you had people as politically autonomous as Norman Lamont and Yanis Varoufakis coming together under the banner of defending sovereignty and fighting the tyranny of Brussels. You know, a less friendly observer would probably say that the Eurosceptic right in the UK was not that concerned about the democratic rights of Greeks, but much more concerned to use the Greek crisis as a stick with which to beat the EU. But I think it's an interesting case of the kind of strange bedfellows that the long and painful EU crisis has fostered upon us. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Λοιπόν, παίρνω ερωτήσεις από εσάς. Θα κάνω εγώ μια ερώτηση παρατήρηση χρησιμοποιώντας το προνόμιο της έδρας στα ελληνικά. Η παρατήρησή μου είναι ότι σε όλη τη συζήτηση που γίνεται αυτόν τον καιρό στη Μεγάλη Βρετανία, τόσο οι υποστηρικτές της εξόδου, όσο και οι υποστηρικτές της παραμονής, θεωρούν δεδομένο ότι η ψήφος των Βρετανών θα επηρεάσει την τύχη της Βρετανίας, καταρχήν, αφήνοντας την Ευρώπη να συνεχίσει να είναι Ευρώπη. Την επόμενη μέρα, είτε οι Βρετανοί έχουν ψηφίσει να μείνουν είτε να φύγουν, αυτό θα αφορά εκείνους, η Ευρώπη θα συνεχίσει να είναι η Ευρώπη και οι Βρετανοί απλώς θα έχουν την ευκαιρία ενδεχομένως να επαναδιαπραγματευτούν μαζί τους μια καλύτερη σχέση. Ιδίως αυτή είναι η άποψη των υποστηρικτών της εξόδου. Αν δεν συμβεί έτσι όμως, αν μια αρνητική ψήφος της Μεγάλης Βρετανίας οδηγήσει σε μια αλυσίδα αντίστοιχων πολιτικών διαδικασιών που θα κάνουν τις ευρωπαϊκές πρωτεύουσες, το Παρίσι, το Βερολίνο, τη Μαδρίτη, θα έλεγα περισσότερο τις πρωτεύουσες του Βορρά παρά του Νότου, να μοιάζουν όλο και περισσότερο με τη Βουδαπέστη, την Πρατισλάβα, τη Βιέννη. Αν δηλαδή λίγο μετά το Βρετανικό δημοψήφισμα και αν το αποτέλεσμα του δημοψηφίσματος είναι αρνητικό, μια αλυσίδα αντίστοιχων διαδικασιών αρχίσει να οδηγεί στην διάλυση αυτού που ως τώρα ξέρουμε ως Ευρώπη, μήπως τελικά οι Βρετανοί χρειαστεί να επιστρέψουν στη διαλυμένη πια Ευρώπη για άλλη μια φορά, να παίξουν ένα ρόλο στην επανασυγκόλλησή της. Η ερώτηση μου είναι αυτή. Μήπως το βρετανικό debate για το referendum αγνοεί υπερβολικά τις πιθανές επιπτώσεις της βρετανικής ψήφου στην συνοχή της υπόλοιπης Ευρώπης, η οποία μπορεί να αποδειχθεί ότι δεν είναι και τόσο συνεκτική όσο νομίζουμε. Αυτή είναι η δικιά μου ερώτηση. Την έκανα λίγο μακρύτερη από ό,τι θα επιτρέψω τις δικές σας ερωτήσεις. Παρακαλώ, κυρίες και κύριοι, όποιος θέλει. Θα χρειαστεί όμως ένα μικρόφωνο για να μεταφράζετε ενδεχομένως η ερώτησή σας.
Ευχαριστώ. Η ερώτησή μου, κύριε Ζήμα, έχει κάποια σχέση με τη δική σας, αλλά παίρνω αφορμή κυρίως από την τοποθέτηση του καθηγητή του κύριου Φλογαΐτη στο τέλος, όπου είπε ότι έθιξε δηλαδή το θέμα της καλής επιρροής που θα είχε στην εξέλιξη της Ευρώπης η παραμονή της Αγγλίας. Από την αρχή με προβλημάτισε και εμένα αυτό το στοιχείο και ιδίως από τη στιγμή που ο κύριος Μάρτιν, αν δεν κάνω λάθος, είπε ότι, που ήταν με το BREXIT, ότι δεν θα επηρεάσει, ας πούμε, και ότι καλύτερα η Ευρώπη θα τα βρει μόνη της. Εκείνο που εγώ πρόσεξα από όλες τις παρατηρήσεις είναι ότι άλλος λιγότερο, άλλος περισσότερο, όλοι είπαν ότι η Ευρώπη έχει προβλήματα και το ξέρουμε βέβαια όλοι. Λοιπόν, το ερώτημα, εάν η παραμονή της Αγγλίας θα βοηθήσει στην πώς να το πω, σε μια επανασύνταξη της Ευρώπης σε πιο σωστές και πιο δημοκρατικές κατευθύνσεις, θα βοηθήσει ή όχι. Και θα ήθελα την γνώμη, ας πούμε, ή δυνατόν όλων των ομιλητών. Ευχαριστώ.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Ναι, ο κύριος.
Ονομάζομαι Φενέκος, είμαι ναύαρχος του πολεμικού ναυτικού, ένα αποστρατεία. Η ερώτησή μου έχει να κάνει με το ότι ο κόσμος σήμερα θέλει ηγέτιδες δυνάμεις. Είμαστε σε ένα χαοτικό κόσμο όπου οι συντελεστές ισχύως αλλάζουν χέρια και η Αγγλία πάντα ιστορικά είχε αυτό το ρόλο. Παρήχε όραμα με τη δημοκρατία, με την εξωστρέφειά της, με τον ηγετικό της ρόλο. Σας θυμίζω ότι η Αγγλία δεν δίστασε να θυσιάσει το 45% του στόλου της και να πάει στα Φόκλαντ, να θυσιάσει μεγάλα οικονομικά συμφέροντα, γιατί για το συμβολισμό του ηγέτη. Αν λοιπόν η Αγγλία φύγει αυτή τη στιγμή από την Ευρώπη, αντιλαμβάνεστε ότι δημιουργείται ένα κενό εξουσίας τεράστιο. Και ρωτάω, το δημοψήφισμα είναι αποτέλεσμα οικονομικών συμφερόντων ή έλλειψης ηθικού αναστήματος που αναμένουμε από την Αγγλία, ένα πρόβλημα εσωτερικό στη λαϊκή σκέψη που δεν της επιτρέπει να έχει τον παραδοσιακό ηγετικό ρόλο στον οποίο ευελπιστούμε όλοι μας. Ευχαριστώ.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Ας μείνουμε εδώ. So, let's give the speakers the opportunity to reply, or even to reply to each other. I think... Πόσο χρόνο τους δίνουμε, 4 λεπτά? 2. So, you have 2 minutes to reply. I think we should reverse the order so that Mr. Davis speaks first.
One, two. Yes, thank you very much. I think I'll use my 2 minutes to take the 2 issues that have been raised from the floor. I think these are 2 very important issues. First of all, the question of whether is this a British issue alone, which was at the essence of the first question, and whether in fact this would have an effect on the cohesion of Europe. Well, as a representative of the Leave campaign, what I would maintain is that an economically stronger UK is going to benefit Europe and benefit the global economy. I don't believe that any of the common sense regulation that has taken place between the United Kingdom and the Brussels regulator since 1973 is going to change. That's one important point for the first speaker. For the Admiral, with all due respect, sir, I don't think this is a question of lack of moral standing. I do think that the UK has shown in its history that it's been always willing to go the extra mile, and I don't think the Brexit issue is an example of Britain not living, that the conclusion of this will be that Britain won't live up to its responsibilities. A little comment on the Falkland Islands. Maybe there were issues to do with the Antarctic that had more to do with than just Argentina.
Thank you very much, sir. Κύριε Φλογαΐτη.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Δουλεύει. Εντάξει. Ευχαριστώ πολύ, κύριε Πρόεδρε. Νομίζω ότι είναι κοινός τόπος ότι η Ευρώπη χρειάζεται να ξαναφτιαχθεί από την αρχή. Αυτό που συμβαίνει με την Ουγγαρία, την Σλοβακία, τις βαλτικές χώρες, την Πολωνία, ο σκεπτικισμός που βλέπουμε στην Μεγάλη Βρετανία κατηγορούνται συνέχεια από τις φιλοευρωπαϊκές δυνάμεις, από όλους εμάς, ως άνθρωποι που δεν καταλαβαίνουν, ως τρελοί, ως άνθρωποι οι οποίοι βγαίνουν πολύ εύκολα έξω από την ευρωπαϊκή οικογένεια. Εγώ προσωπικά πάντοτε έλεγα ότι πρέπει να προσέξουμε τι λένε αυτοί οι άνθρωποι. Δεν μπορεί να είναι τόσο πολλοί αυτοί οι οποίοι λένε ότι δεν μας αρέσει κάτι, τούτο, εκείνο ή το παράλληλο. Και έχω ταξιδέψει και έχω μιλήσει και με τους Σλοβάκους και τους Ούγγρους, με όλους αυτούς. Και στην Αγγλία είχα πολλές φορές την ευκαιρία να συζητήσω με απλούς ανθρώπους, οι οποίοι σε εξηγούν γιατί δεν θέλουν να μείνουν στην Ευρώπη. Πρέπει επιτέλους με αυτούς τους ανθρώπους να συζητήσουμε. Είμαστε υποχρεωμένοι να καταλάβουμε τι λένε, γιατί κάτι λένε, και να δούμε εάν αυτό που πιστεύει η Ευρώπη των 6 ότι είναι η Ευρώπη, αν πράγματι μπορεί να είναι σήμερα. Είπα προηγουμένως ότι η Ευρώπη των 6 ήταν το βασίλειο του Καρολομάγνου. Όμως οι βαλτικές χώρες, η Ελλάδα, τι σχέση έχουν με το βασίλειο του Καρολομάγνου? Καμία. Κάνουμε μια αναγωγή στις κοινές ευρωπαϊκές αξίες, αλλά εάν εξαιρέσετε το πρόγραμμα Εράσμους που είναι για τους φοιτητές, δεν υπάρχει κανένα ευρωπαϊκό πρόγραμμα το οποίο να δημιουργεί τον Ευρωπαίο του αύριο. Κανένα άλλο. Πόσες φορές εμείς οι Έλληνες είδαμε Λιθουανούς και πόσες φορές οι Λιθουανοί είδαν Έλληνες? Πόσες φορές μιλήσαμε με Σλοβάκους? Έχουμε μιλήσει πολλές φορές με Γάλλους, πολλές φορές με Γερμανούς, πολλές φορές με Ιταλούς. Δεν έχουμε μιλήσει με όλους τους Ευρωπαίους. Δεν μας ξέρουνε, δεν τους ξέρουμε. Πρέπει λοιπόν να γίνει κάτι το οποίο να φέρει τους λαούς κοντά, και αυτό το κάτι προϋποθέτει ότι η Ευρώπη των 6 θα ανοίξει τα αυτιά της στους υπόλοιπους 22. Αλλιώς υπάρχει πρόβλημα. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ, κύριε Φλογαϊτή. Now, let me turn to Ian Martin.
Thank you very much. I'll be very quick, just conscious that people are probably wanting a drink, really, rather than listening to more of me. The first point is on the lack of moral standing. I would say, sir, that it's precisely the opposite, and that if Britain does decide to leave the European Union, it is taking a stand. It is declaring that the European Union as currently constituted is a broken model, which, via the single currency, has failed. On Scotland, someone mentioned Scotland. I would treat the claims that it will lead to an independence referendum with caution, speaking as a Scot. I think if Britain votes to leave, and then the Scottish nationalists say immediately, well, this is disgraceful, Scotland has been pulled out of the European Union against its will, there must be a referendum to break up the United Kingdom, you're then into territory where the nationalists have to argue that they want to break away from the UK and try and join the euro, which is not an attractive pitch. And actually, you look at the polling in Scotland, most Scots don't want another referendum, certainly not at the moment. And to the person who made the point about, is it pure opportunism by the Brexiteers and those who want to leave the EU, who just jumped on the Greek crisis, and the implication was that there was some relish. I'm sure that is the case for some people, but certainly most of the people I know on the left and on the right in the UK who were very energized by what was happening were motivated by a genuine concern. And there was the outrage about what was happening, and the way particularly in which the Germans were conducting policy was genuine and not opportunistic.
Thank you. Simon Nixon.
Thanks very much. I think after this debate, people might still be wondering what problem it is exactly that Brexit is supposed to solve. I mean, we're told that that Britain will be able to trade more freely outside the EU, but Germany is already the most successful exporting country in the world, and it's in the EU. We're told that Brexit might enable the UK to have less regulation, but the UK is already one of the least regulated countries in the world, according to the OECD. We're told that being outside the EU, we could escape having to subsidize agriculture, and yet the Eurosceptics in Britain go around telling the farmers that they would keep all the subsidies for agriculture. In fact, Switzerland pays even more subsidies to its farmers than the EU does. Ian said that Brexit, that free movement of people was fueling the rise of the far right in Europe, but there isn't much free movement from EU countries into France or Denmark at the moment. It's not Poles or Lithuanians going to these countries that's fueling the far right. It's non-EU migration that's causing the rise of the far right. And then the heart of the problem that the Brexit campaign has is that ultimately, not only they cannot describe exactly what the problem is it's supposed to solve, but what will post-Brexit look like. And over the last few weeks of the campaign, they come up every few days with a new model. One minute the UK's model is going to be Norway, which has to accept all EU rules, pay into the budget and accept free movement of people. The next day it's going to be Switzerland, which does most of those things but doesn't have access to the single market financial services. Then we're going to go just straight to a WTO model and be like Canada. And then we're going to be like Albania. And so we had more positions than the Kama Sutra from the Brexit campaign in terms of what they're going to be. And the problem is that all of these different positions are deeply flawed. None of them offer the UK what it has right now. And I think that should really answer the question that came from the floor about the cohesion of Europe, and which I think is absolutely central, as I tried to make clear in my opening remarks. I think one of the problems that the Brexit campaign has is that although they've had 30 years of thinking about this, they haven't really thought it through. The heart of their campaign is a whole, which is a whole where some understanding of the perspective of the other 27 countries in Europe should be. And I worry that if there is a Brexit, it really will badly damage the stability, security and prosperity of Europe. I don't think that one can just rely on goodwill in this situation. I think that there will be all sorts of competing national interests will come into play, and that could be incredibly destabilizing for Europe. I think there's no country that has more to lose from Brexit other than the UK itself than Greece, and I do hope that Greeks, in the last few weeks, will do what they can to try and persuade my compatriots not to make a terrible mistake. Thank you.
There's a question. One last question.
Thank you. Είχα την τιμή να εργαστώ στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση για 12 χρόνια και να ζήσω από κοντά σημαντικές εξελίξεις, όπως η διεύρυνση, το Ευρωπαϊκό Σύνταγμα, πτυχές της οικονομικής πολιτικής και εξελίξεις στα ζητήματα των πολιτικών ελευθεριών. Βλέποντας την Ευρώπη σήμερα, πραγματικά δεν ξέρω τι θα ψήφιζα αν ήμουν Βρετανίδα. Σημείωσα τη διαπίστωση, η οποία ακούστηκε από τους περισσότερους ομιλητές, ότι η Ευρώπη πρέπει να ξαναχτιστεί από την αρχή. Ρωτώ λοιπόν, με ποιους όρους και με ποιες διαδικασίες μπορεί να γίνει αυτό. Ευχαριστώ.
Ευχαριστώ. Ερώτηση 1-2. Ναι. You have the opportunity to answer, but 2 more questions.
Καλησπέρα σε όλους. Με λένε Θεοδωρακίδη Παναγιώτη και θέλω να ρωτήσω κάτι που δεν αναφέρθηκε. επειδή είναι γνωστό ότι οι σχέσεις οικονομίας και άμυνας είναι καταλυτικές στην ισχύ της κάθε χώρας και επειδή πρόσφατα και ανολοκλήρωτα γίνεται προσπάθεια από τις ΗΠΑ να ολοκληρωθεί ένα ευρωατλαντικό σύμφωνο με τη Γερμανία, κατά πόσο παραμονή στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση του Ηνωμένου Βασιλείου θα είναι καταλυτική ή πολιτικό εργαλείο για την ισορροπία περαιτέρω των δυνάμεων στην προσεχή πεντηκονταετία. Αυτό δεν αναλύθηκε.
Ενδιαφέρον. Ευχαριστώ. Η κυρία έχει ζητήσει, είναι η τελευταία ερώτηση.
Ευχαριστώ με στα περιεχομένου και τα δύο μέρη. Η ερώτησή μου είναι η εξής. Οι υπέρμαχοι του φεύγουμε από την Ενωμένη Ευρώπη του Μεγάλου Βασιλείου σκέφτονται να εργαστούν με ένα καινούριο υπόδειγμα από εδώ και πέρα για μια άλλη Ενωμένη Ευρώπη? Και αν ναι, έχουμε τέτοιες συζητήσεις ήδη?
So, short questions, short answers, whoever wants. Yes.
Just very quickly, I just wanted to pass on some news from London tonight. There's a poll just broken. ICM, which is probably the lead pollster, has Leave on 52 and Remain on 48.
Can I answer questions? Okay. First of all, the question, for me, the elephant in the room is the assumption that Brexit is a weakness for the UK. I think there's been a very strong scare campaign from the Remain campaign that if Britain was to leave the EU, this would actually be a lose-lose scenario. But I must say, whether it be the governor of the Bank of England, a whole scenario of economists, both in Europe and in the UK, there are no convincing arguments, actually, that a Brexit would lead to a financially weaker United Kingdom. And for example, the very fact that there's an opportunity for the UK to increase its trade with the WTO is something which is not being necessarily considered as something which could be very, very positive. And a quick comment on the question, both question and comment that came behind me. We in Denmark actually have been, with the European Union, have been very involved in TTIP. TTIP is a transatlantic trade and investment partnership, not just between Germany and the US, but actually between the EU and the US. I'm afraid I don't think it's going to be signed while Mr. President Obama is still in office. And I think the speed with which it progresses will very much depend on who wins the American election.
Thank you. Someone from the state side? Simon? No. Yeah.
Hi. So the question of how should Europe change? But I think that Europe is always changing. I listed some ways in which it's changed just the last 5 or 6 years, with the creation of a bailout fund, a banking union. Now there's moves to create a border force, new rules on counter-terrorism and policing. And as I said in my opening remarks, these are all about finding common solutions to common problems. So how Europe should change and how it will change is in response to common problems. And the speed at which it does that will depend upon the willingness of 28 sovereign governments to find common solutions. And as I say, I think so far that the record suggests that the EU does find those common solutions, not immediately. The process can be cumbersome, but it tends to get there, and those are all enhancing of European prosperity and stability. And I think the question about the new paradigm for United Europe is an extremely important one, because I think that, there's a tendency from the Brexit side in the UK to dismiss the European project as some new fangled invention that is completely alien to our history and must be rejected. But of course, this is just the latest European project. There have been many European projects over the centuries. Most of them have ended in total disaster. This one has, I think, tries to address some of the problems in previous European projects. It tries to rely on the rule of law, respect for small countries, and with democracy at its heart. And so I think that it is absolutely for the Brexit campaign. They don't have a new model for Britain's relationship with Europe, but I think that a central question for the Brexit campaign is to try and explain what their model is for the rest of Europe. And I don't think they have one of those for the future management of Europe, and I don't think they have an answer to that either.
Dennis McShane, would you?
Just as a journalist myself, Ian Martin's point about the opinion poll is extremely significant because there's been a wide gap on all the opinion polls on Brexit between online polls, which tend to show a bit of support for Brexit, or 50-50, and telephone polls, which have always shown a very strong majority for Remain. The company that Ian mentioned does telephone polls, and tonight the fact on a telephone poll Leave or Brexit has moved to 52% is very significant. That said, all the polls, as I said earlier on, are based, the pollsters themselves are very worried. They don't have a previous sample or a control. But I'm glad Ian is a working journalist, even if he's debating Brexit, and brings the news from the front line. I simply want to say this, that I think if Brexit does happen, it will be contagion. It will be a huge boost for what I call PopNat, populist nationalist politics around the world. They're on the right, they can also be on the left. It is, someone's out to get us. Someone's out to do us down. It's not our fault that Greece is poor, not our fault that there's poverty in America or there's many immigrants in America. It's the fault of the other. And I think it's a flight from responsibility and a flight from honesty that frightens me, and that there's a simple solution. Quit the European Union. I expect Donald Trump might offer a referendum on quitting the United Nations. And you know, I'm not sure, I'm confident which way the United States would vote. And I think after this, it'll be very hard to stop. Already Bruno Le Maire's done it in France, Marine Le Pen's done it in France. If Brexit happens, I believe Sarkozy, in order to get the nomination, will say, let's have a referendum in France. Monsieur Juppé, I think, will hold the fort. I'm not sure François Hollande will, because if you want to get elected, you make promises. And so we're entering a very difficult new era. But populist nationalism throughout history has never solved economic problems, hasn't created works, new jobs. And I just worry that the politics of emotion, of passion, of nationalism, of populism, if approved of by the British people in a Brexit poll, will be the defining politics for the next period. And yeah, when I was a little boy, when I first came to Greece, I hitchhiked through Yugoslavia. Then I came by train through Yugoslavia. Maybe I drove through Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia was completely Pacific. It was a happy country. The Yugoslavs, citizens, did not need visas to go to Europe. There was tourism, there was press, there was intellectual ferment in Belgrade and Croatia and in Zagreb and Ljubljana and elsewhere. And then what happened? Nationalist populism was unleashed. I'm just warning people that do not assume we live in Immanuel Kant's idea of perpetual peace. We don't. We live by checks and balances. Right now, we don't know how to make several steps forward, particularly on the economic front. I think if we had growth in Europe, jobs in Europe, investment in Europe, good public finances in Europe, a lot of these problems would dissolve themselves away. But I think Brexit will be a terrible, terrible start to potentially a very frightening new era in our democratic politics. Mr. Putin has just got Twitter to close down a spoof Twitter account, which, you know, the real Vladimir Putin, which used to put out tweets satirizing him, sending him up, and he's ordered Twitter to close it down, and Twitter has complied. The future may be much more Erdogan and Putin than Schuman or Monet, and I don't like that future.
Κύριε Πρόεδρε, κυρίες και κύριοι, έχω την εντύπωση, κύριε Τσίμ, ότι μάλλον έχει εξαντληθεί το κομμάτι των ερωταπαντήσεων. Ήταν εξαιρετική τιμή και εξαιρετικό πλεονέκτημα η συζήτηση για το αν η Μεγάλη Βρετανία θα έπρεπε ή όχι να βγει από την πιο προχωρημένη, μέχρι σήμερα τουλάχιστον, ελληνική έννοια της Ευρώπης, την Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση, να έρθει στην Αθήνα. Στο δικό μου το μυαλό, συνοψίζοντας αυτά τα οποία αντελήφθην ότι τόσο ο Σάιμον Νίξον, ο καθηγητής ο κύριος Λογαΐτης, ο Ιαν Μάρτιν και ο Μαριάνο Ντέιβις υποστηρίζουν, υπάρχει μια κοινή βάση. Όλοι, μα όλοι, οι οποίοι συζητούν με επιχειρήματα και αναλύουν, συμφωνούν ότι αυτό το οποίο χρειάζεται, αυτό το οποίο ο καθένας με τον τρόπο του επιδιώκει, είναι μια επαναδιαπραγμάτευση για μια αναθεωρημένη, μια αναμορφωμένη Ευρώπη. Ίσως η τακτική είναι διαφορετική, ο στόχος όμως φαίνεται ίδιος. Και θα μου επιτρέψετε να κλείσω λοιπόν ένα τόσο σοβαρό θέμα με ένα μικρό λογοπαίγνιο. Για σκεφτείτε, αν αυτό το δημοψήφισμα ήταν τελικά για το συμφέρον των πολιτών και δεν είχε προκύψει από πολιτικές ισορροπίες, για σκεφτείτε αν αυτό το δημοψήφισμα είχε ως ερώτημα: θέλετε, Βρετανοί πολίτες, να επιχειρήσουμε να επαναδιαπραγματευτούμε μια ανανεωμένη Ευρώπη με βασικές αρχές, πρώτον, την εκδημοκρατικοποίησή της, δεύτερον, την αποτελεσματικότητά της, τρίτην, την πρόοδο και την ευημερία όλης της Ευρώπης και όλων όσων επιδιώκουμε να συμμετάσχουν σε αυτήν, από το ένα ξερό ερώτημα μέσα ή έξω, ή για να το πω ομά, θέλετε μια καλύτερη Ευρώπη ή όχι. Νομίζω ότι από αυτή τη συζήτηση, σε αυτό το επίπεδο των ομιλητών, σε αυτό το επίπεδο του διαλόγου, είναι ξεκάθαρο ότι ανεξάρτητα από το τι θα ψηφίσει οποιοσδήποτε από τους Βρετανούς πολίτες που βρίσκονται σήμερα εδώ ή από αυτούς οι οποίοι συζητούν και σκέφτονται, η απάντηση είναι η μία και μόνη. Ναι, θέλουμε όλοι μια καλύτερη Ευρώπη. Κυρίες και κύριοι, σας ευχαριστώ θερμά, κύριε Πρόεδρε, για την εξαιρετική τιμή που μας κάνατε, κυρία Μεντεσίδου, κύριοι Πρόεδροι, συνάδελφοι, και θα μου επιτρέψετε να σας καλέσω σε ένα ποτό δείγμα της Ευρωπαϊκής Ενοποίησης έξω στο προαύλιο της Παλιάς Βουλής, το οποίο το προσφέρει η Pernod Ricard, μια γαλλική εταιρεία, την οποία μάλιστα διοικεί στην Ελλάδα ο πρόεδρος του Ελληνοβρετανικού Επιμελητηρίου, ο συναδελφός μου και φίλος ο Κριστόφ Λεμαριέ, η οποία διαχειρίζεται στην Ελλάδα τη Chivas Regal. Ό,τι πιο παραδοσιακό και γνωστό υπάρχει σε βρετανικό ουίσκι. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ. Καλό σας βράδυ.